Forget what you think you know about medieval warfare. This isn't just about knights in shining armor and noble sword fights. The Middle Ages gave birth to some of the most dangerous, unpredictable, and downright insane weapons in history, so extreme that they were banned, hidden, or erased from the battlefield. In this video, we're diving into 6 weapons that pushed the limits of brutality, broke the rules of war, and terrified kings, priests, and generals alike. Why were they so terrifying? Who tried to ban them? And what happened to them after the dust of battle settled? Number 1. Crossbow. The art hateful to God. In April 1139, the Catholic Church drew a line in the sand. During the Second Lateran Council convened by Pope Innocent II, a powerful declaration was made. Anyone using a crossbow or even a regular bow against fellow Christians would face excommunication. This wasn't just a moral statement, it was a weaponized political message. The council officially labeled the crossbow a murderous art, one that was hateful to God. That phrasing wasn't random. It reflected a deep fear within both the church and the ruling elite that the traditional balance of medieval power, anchored in nobility, knightly warfare, and a rigid class system, was under direct threat. The core of the concern wasn't just about violence. Violence had always been a part of feudal life. It was about who could now wield that violence. The crossbow was revolutionary because it gave commoners, peasants, townsfolk, militia, an effective deadly tool that required only minimal training. Unlike the longbow, which demanded years of skill and strength, a crossbow could be loaded, aimed, and fired with deadly precision in a matter of weeks. Worse, its quarrel bolts could pierce even the most expensive chainmail or plate armor that noble knights wore into battle. Suddenly, a low-born foot soldier could take down a mounted aristocrat with a single well-placed shot. This wasn't just battlefield innovation, it was a direct challenge to the social hierarchy. Medieval warfare had long been designed around elite combat. Knights weren't just soldiers, they were icons of feudal power. Their prestige was tied to martial superiority, personal honor, and the idea that war was a noble endeavor. The crossbow, by contrast, was seen as dishonorable, unchivalrous, even cowardly. It didn't require strength or bravery, only aim. It reduced war to something mechanized, impersonal, and accessible to the masses. And that terrified the ruling class. Of course, the church's declaration tried to paint the ban as a moral issue. The crossbow was framed as spiritually wrong, not just socially destabilizing. Killing from a distance without warning was cast as anti-Christian, especially when aimed at other Christians. The papal edict notably didn't object to its use against non-Christians. In crusades and campaigns against so-called infidels, crossbows were still tolerated, even praised. But the ban didn't last. Despite its spiritual weight, the excommunication threat had little real enforcement. As conflicts across Europe escalated from the Crusades to regional wars, the practicality of the crossbow won out. By the 13th century, even the papal armies were using them. Crusaders wielded them freely. The church quietly overlooked its own ruling, and by the mid-14th century, crossbows had become a normalized, even celebrated part of European warfare. The attempt to ban the crossbow shows how deeply technology can unsettle the structures of power. What started as a moral condemnation was really about control, about who gets to kill and who gets to stay in charge. The failure of the ban proves something else, too. When a weapon is too effective to ignore, even God's supposed disapproval won't keep it off the battlefield. Number 2. Greek fire. Greek fire wasn't just some medieval flamethrower, it was a terrifying, game-changing weapon that turned entire naval battles into firestorms. Developed by the Byzantine Empire around the 7th century, it worked like liquid fire that could burn on water, stick to ships, and keep blazing no matter how hard you tried to put it out. It created pure chaos. But what made it even more insane wasn't just the effect, it was the level of secrecy around it. The recipe was guarded like a state religion. Revealing it to anyone outside the empire wasn't just treason, it was considered a sin punishable by divine wrath. Byzantine emperors treated the formula like a sacred inheritance. They didn't write it down, and it wasn't taught openly. Instead, they split the knowledge among different groups. One group worked on the chemical compound, another built the siphons, and another managed deployment. That way, no single person ever knew the whole process. Even if one part got captured or betrayed, the enemy still wouldn't know how to recreate the weapon. Emperor Constantine VII, for example, made it very clear in his instructions to successors: never under any circumstance let the formula fall into foreign hands. Some records even claim that a man who tried to sell the secret to enemies died suddenly in a freak accident, interpreted as a sign of divine punishment. Greek fire was mainly used in naval warfare. The Byzantines mounted special pressure-powered siphons on the front of their warships, known as dromons. During sea battles, these bronze tubes would shoot out the flaming liquid in a continuous stream, setting entire enemy fleets ablaze. Portable handheld versions were sometimes used in land sieges too. The psychological impact was massive. Ships didn't just burn, they exploded into panic. Sailors jumped overboard, even if it meant drowning. Some accounts describe the noise as thunder, the flames as dragon breath. Nobody had seen anything like it. And it wasn't just the effect, it was the mystery. No one outside the Empire ever figured out how it worked. The mixture may have included ingredients like naphtha, sulfur, quicklime, or pine resin, but nobody knows for sure. The point is, it couldn't be reverse engineered, because there was never a complete recipe to copy. What's wild is that despite how powerful Greek fire was, it eventually disappeared. By the 14th century, there were no more credible reports of it being used. Several reasons might explain that. The fall of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade caused massive destruction of state knowledge and records. The empire lost control of oil-producing regions needed for key ingredients. And the rise of gunpowder weapons started to change the rules of warfare altogether. Whatever the reason, the formula was lost. Not leaked, not stolen, just gone. Number 3, Stiletto, the sneak's weapon. In the shadowy streets of Renaissance Italy, where political intrigue and street violence walked hand in hand, the stiletto became infamous, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of silent death. Unlike the broadswords of knights or the hefty maces of footmen, the stiletto wasn't made for show or for open battle. It was thin, sharp, and incredibly discreet. You didn't see it coming, that was the point. This blade wasn't designed for cutting. It wasn't about slashing or parrying. It was a stabbing weapon, pure and simple. Long, needle-like, with a strong triangular or square cross-section, it was built to pierce armor gaps and slip between ribs. The stiletto could bypass even chainmail, sliding through its loops where other blades would catch and glance off. In a world where many people still wore some form of body protection, that made it terrifyingly effective. But its real strength wasn't just in its design, it was in its concealability. Unlike the bulky swords that hung from belts, a stiletto could be hidden in a sleeve, a boot, or even sewn into clothing. That made it the perfect tool, not for soldiers, but for assassins, criminals, and political agents. In a back alley or a crowded market, a single thrust could end a life, and the killer would vanish before anyone noticed what had happened. City authorities quickly caught on. Italian city-states, which were already struggling with waves of gang violence, civil unrest, and vendettas between noble families, saw the stiletto not as a noble weapon, but a public menace. They began calling it arma insidiosa, or treacherous weapon, a term reserved for tools of ambush and betrayal. Laws were passed banning the carrying of stilettos in public. In places like Florence, Venice, and Rome, if you were caught with one tucked under your cloak, you could face a fine, imprisonment, or worse, depending on the situation. The crackdown wasn't just about crime, it was about image. As Renaissance culture began to idolize the gentleman duelist, public fighting became more structured. Formal duels emphasize style, honor, and control. The stiletto, with its sneaky, no-rules energy, didn't fit that picture. Over time, it was pushed out of the mainstream. In its place came the rapier, a longer, more elegant sword, suited to public dueling and a performance of skill. The stiletto faded into the shadows from which it came, lingering only in crime circles and personal revenge. Still, its legacy is unforgettable. Even centuries later, the word stiletto conjures images of danger, stealth, and precision. It's in the shape of modern high-heeled shoes. It still appears in movies and crime fiction as the blade of choice for silent kills. In the end, the stiletto was banned not just for what it did, but for what it represented. The fear that anyone, anywhere, could be armed and deadly, and you'd never even know it until it was too late. Number 4, flail. Chaos incarnate. The medieval flail is one of those weapons that looks absolutely terrifying, and for good reason. It was usually made up of a wooden handle, a length of chain, and a spiked or studded metal ball at the end. Sometimes, especially in the later versions, it came with multiple chains and balls, which only added to the unpredictability. At a glance, it seems like the kind of thing that could devastate anything in its path, and that's partly true. But the reality of the flail's use in battle is a lot messier, both literally and figuratively. The idea behind the flail made sense on paper. A weapon that could swing around shields, crush armor, and deliver bone-breaking power with each strike. It wasn't restricted by the straight line of a sword or the rigid impact of a mace. It could build momentum, whip through the air, and hit with a force that was as psychological as it was physical. The sound alone, a heavy, spiked ball whipping through the air, could shake up enemy troops. But here's the thing. Flails weren't just dangerous to the enemy, they were dangerous to the people using them. In the hands of a trained fighter, they were still unpredictable. The chain made it difficult to control the exact path of the strike. Miss your target, and the weapon might keep swinging, hit your leg, your shield, or worse, your ally standing beside you. That's why many Central European urban militias in the 15th century decided to just not deal with it. They started banning flails from regular military use. Not because they were ineffective, but because they were uncontrollable. Fencing schools had the same attitude. These were places meant to train soldiers, guards, and civilians in real, applicable combat skills. Swordsmanship, polearms, even dagger fighting, these were taught systematically. The flail, though, most fencing schools refused to teach it. They considered it too risky, especially for beginners. Instructors said it was more likely to injure the user than the opponent. It wasn't a weapon of discipline, it was a tool of chaos. There's also something to be said about how little the flail actually appears in documented medieval battles. Despite how often it shows up in modern movies, games, and fantasy books, real historical accounts rarely mention it. In fact, many museum flails from the 19th century were either reproductions or outright fakes, created more for the imaginations of tourists than as reflections of real warfare. On the battlefield, where coordination and discipline were key, especially in tight infantry formations, the flail was more of a liability than an advantage. Imagine a row of soldiers advancing in formation, and one of them starts swinging a flail wildly. There's no way that ends well. That's likely why it was gradually phased out of serious use. The weapon might have looked intimidating, but that wasn't enough to make it practical. Number 5, night weapons in London. Curfew disarmament. In the late 13th century, London was not the majestic metropolis we picture today. It was a tight, chaotic maze of crooked streets, poorly lit alleys, and overcrowded housing. After sundown, the city turned into a different world entirely. Dark, tense, and dangerous. No street lamps, no patrol cars, no organized police force. Just flickering lanterns and the occasional town watchman. And in this shadowy setting, violence thrived. But that's where the 1285 statute came in, a clear and bold response to a growing problem. The law declared that once the city's evening bell rang, signaling curfew, No one was allowed to walk the streets carrying swords, bucklers, knives, or any other weapon that could be used for mischief. Anyone caught violating this rule was arrested and jailed until morning. It was blunt, immediate justice. Why did this happen? Because the streets were basically a battlefield at night. Gangs of young men, often drunk and armed, roamed the city, starting fights, robbing travelers, and settling personal feuds. The combination of alcohol, ego, and easy access to deadly tools turned the city's nights into chaos. Even simple disputes over a spilled drink or an insult could escalate into full-blown sword fights in the middle of the street. Shopkeepers, travelers, and honest townsfolk were caught in the crossfire, or worse, directly targeted. The law was not about banning weapons completely. It wasn't anti-weapon. It was about timing and control. During the day, people could still carry arms, especially for defense or travel. But after dark, the risks changed. The authorities realized that violence didn't need a war. It just needed a little darkness and a couple of hot-headed men with steel in their hands. By removing weapons from the equation during those risky nighttime hours, the city hoped to cool things down. This curfew disarmament wasn't just a London thing. It inspired similar laws in other major European cities. From Paris to Florence, local governments started adopting restrictions on nighttime weapon possession. It wasn't because they feared war, it was because they feared their own citizens when the lights went out. And even more than that, they feared the breakdown of social order. A city that couldn't keep its own peace at night was vulnerable, both inside and out. What makes this law so interesting is how modern it feels. It wasn't about punishing intent, it was about preventing opportunity. Modern cities have laws about weapons in bars, around schools, or in public during large gatherings. That idea that certain times and places are too volatile for weapons is straight out of medieval London. The 1285 statute laid the groundwork for these modern safety ideas, long before police sirens and surveillance cameras existed. Number 6. Saltpeter ban in Song China, 1076. Back in the 11th century, long before gunpowder weapons transformed European warfare, China was already dealing with the explosive potential of chemistry. The Song dynasty, known for its scientific advancements, trade, and military challenges, was also the birthplace of some of the earliest true firearms. And with that came a serious problem: control. By 1076, the Song court issued an official ban on the private sale and distribution of saltpeter and sulfur, two of the three main ingredients for gunpowder. This wasn't just about safety or trade regulation. It was a strategic decision, driven by fear of rebellion, sabotage, and the rise of weapons far too powerful to be left in civilian hands. Officials recognized early that access to these materials could tip the balance of power in the wrong direction. The fear wasn't just theoretical. There were already signs of independent groups experimenting with fire lances, early hand cannons, and incendiary spears, all powered by black powder. At the time, China's central government was under constant pressure from border conflicts and internal instability. The idea of gunpowder in the hands of rebels or criminal factions was terrifying. Saltpeter, a nitrate-rich compound found in decomposing matter, could be harvested from natural sources or specially cultivated, making it a lot more accessible than one might expect. That accessibility was exactly the problem. If too many people figured out how to produce it, or if a merchant sold it freely, the state could quickly lose its monopoly on force. So the Song rulers clamped down hard. Only state-run armories and licensed workshops were allowed to handle saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal in the correct ratios. Government agencies oversaw the transport, storage, and mixing of these elements, guarding recipes with extreme secrecy. In fact, formulas were often split among multiple departments, so that no single official or artisan could leak the full process. This compartmentalization was key to preventing unauthorized use, and it worked for a time. What's striking is how far ahead the Song dynasty was compared to the rest of the world. While European armies were still relying on bows, swords, and horses, the Chinese were launching fire arrows, grenades, and early bombs powered by carefully managed chemical mixtures. These weren't myths. There are records of entire arsenals built to produce powder-based weapons for battlefield use. And they weren't just experimenting, they were deploying. The ban on saltpeter sales became one of the earliest examples of government regulation of dangerous materials for national security. It wasn't about stopping invention, it was about controlling it. The Empire knew the formula had revolutionary potential, so they treated it like state-level intelligence.